Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Balckwellbooks. My name is Balkwell, and today's book is Wieland by Charles Brockden Brown, first published in the year 1798. Now, Charles Brockden Brown is sort of the original American novelist. He's the first American to sort of make a career out of writing novels and was a supreme influence on basically every American writer to follow in the 19th century. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, if you can believe it. So, Charles Brockden Brown, he is not only an influential and the original American author, but he's quintessentially American in this sort of style and the content of this book. However, like many Americans of the time, he's very much influenced by the British tradition, and this book is following in the sort of Gothic novel tradition popular in England. Now, Charles Brockden Brown's Wieland. On this show, we love to cover the masterworks. We love those books that are impeccable in style, in form, that seem totally comprehensive, cohesive, and elegant. But we also love those books that are a little bit clumsy, but very interesting in their clumsiness. And we've covered quite a few of that kind of book as well on this show. And I think Wieland falls into the latter category. I'm very generous with older works. And I'm very generous with works that are written in a tradition or in a style or are written at a time when the expectations for a novel are quite different than they are today in terms of style and in terms of form and in terms of content. And I think Wieland immediately will strike the modern reader as coming from a different time, as having different sensibilities. And so we have to approach the book accepting this fact and relishing in it, really. However, at the same time, we must recognize that even for its time, Wieland's plot gets a little clumsy. And I don't normally sort of review books in this way and make these kind of judgments, but it's hard to ignore the fact that the plot of Wieland really falls quite flat on its face when it comes to resolving the central mystery. And so it's not really a book I would recommend strongly for people to read as a sort of, enjoyable just little read that they can do to have fun. However, there are some very, very interesting qualities to this book that I would like to talk about. But first, we have to talk about what's the book about. This is Wieland by Charles Brockden Brown. Who is Wieland? So the book is written in an epistolary form, in the form of a letter, or a series of letters, I suppose, that a young woman named Clara Wieland is writing, sort of relating her sort of terrible experiences she's had over the course of a few months of her life. And these events involve her brother, Thomas Wieland, and a few other people that they sort of hang around with. They're young people living in America. Their parents are dead in circumstances that I will get into later. Their parents have passed away, and Thomas Wieland, Clara's brother, is married to a woman named Catherine, who is a sort of childhood friend, and they live next door to Clara. So Clara lives here, and so Clara lives in a little house, and then just down the road, down a little path, is Thomas Wieland and his wife, Catherine, and they're hanging out all the time, the best of friends. It's a wonderful life. There's another friend of theirs named Plale, and Plale is a good friend of Thomas Wieland, and they love to just talk, hang out, have intellectual debates about many things. And Clara is maybe a little bit in love with Pleyel, and Pleyel might be a little bit in love with her too. However, Pleyel, he's also in love with a woman in Germany who's married, but then her husband's dead, and then maybe she's dead, and there's a lot of complicated romantic stuff going on there. But more important than that, to us, is the circumstances of Clara and Thomas Wieland's father's death, and what this means for their lives going forward. So, their father, like many Americans, had a personal sense of religion, an individual sense of religion, and a personal relationship with God or the divine. And this sort of took the form of a special type of worship. And basically what he did is he built a little, basically like a gazebo in the backyard. It's not really a it's not like a suburban backyard. This is like an estate. There's a lot of land. But he built a little gazebo, and every day at noon and at midnight, he would go out into the gazebo and do his prayers. And at no point does he ask his family to participate in these prayers, and really does not take much interest in their religious sense in any way. He's all about his own individual relationship with God, and this is very important for what happens in the story. Now, this is a quintessentially American way to be, and many Americans, people who came to America, did so because they belonged to a religious sect where they had a religious understanding that did not gel well with the sort of government-sponsored religions of Europe. Definitely not Catholicism, but even other Protestant Christianities like Anglicanism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, they're just not good enough, And you have all these little sects with just slightly different interpretations of what makes a good Christian life. And this is the important thing. There's differences in dogma, differences in interpretation, but really the main thing is what's a good Christian life, and how should we live as individuals and as a community to sort of best honor God and all the other things we need to do. Wieland, the senior Wieland, has sort of taken this to the extreme, where many of these sects would form communities where, the community all worships in a similar manner. But for him it's personal. For him it's just him and God, and even his family is outside of this picture, right? So one day, the senior Wieland is sitting around, and he gets a strange look in his eye, and he's even more sort of sullen and melancholic than he normally is. He's a very quiet, reserved, sort of sullen man. And everyone's a bit worried about him. And at the strike of midnight, he goes out for his nightly prayers and combusts, essentially. There's a big flash of light, and he's burned in a very curious fashion, where some parts of his body are left untouched, but other parts seem to have been burned in a flame, and it's just a very mysterious sort of happening. And that's how he died. And soon after, the mother dies in a more normal way, but she dies as well. Now, Clara's brother Thomas has taken on many of these sort of he follows after his father, and essentially. He has that sullen, reserved attitude, and he has this desire for religious truth, and a desire to understand what is the proper way for him to relate to God. And him and Pleyel, this sort of friend from earlier who has that romantic entanglement with Clara, they get into many debates, theological debates, intellectual debates, about, what is this good life, and what does all this mean. Pleyel is sort of the foil to Wieland in that he's a very bombastic, very sort of enthusiastic, friendly guy, whereas Thomas Wieland is quite taciturn. So we have these four characters sort of hanging out in their little estate. It's almost like Goethe's elective affinities. We just have these four people sort of wandering around, talking about stuff, and, generally enjoying themselves. And then another man shows up by the name of Carwin. And Carwin is a bit of a mysterious man. Nobody really knows what he's about. He dresses in a strange fashion, but he gets along with the other four, and they start to accept him as a friend of theirs. But as soon as Carwin shows up, strange things begin to happen. And these strange things take the form of the characters hearing voices. And they're hearing voices speak in their ear and sometimes threaten them, sometimes simply call them, sometimes trying to warn them about things. And these voices often take the form of each other. So Thomas is out at night and he hears the voice of his wife Catherine calling him to come home. And he comes home and says, well, what are you calling me for? And Catherine's like, oh, I wouldn't say anything. I was just sitting here. Clara also hears these voices. She hears people in her closet planning to murder her. She hears a man in a sort of on a cliffside telling her that she can only die here and everywhere else she's safe. And just all these sort of weird occurrences. And it's very unclear to the characters whether these voices are benevolent or malevolent, or a combination of the two, whether there's benevolent voices and malicious voices. It's who these voices truly belong to. And it's a very mysterious and it's quite an effective sort of horror story during this first half, because they're in very familiar, very comfortable circumstances, but these very strange things are happening that make these very normal situations feel a little bit unsafe, a little bit off. And so you really get that sense of the everyday sort of horror during these sections. Now, as it turns out, and this is, the resolution of the book that I did not think was particularly effective, it turns out that Carwin, this mysterious man, is a billiquist. Now, what is a billiquist? A billiquist is a ventriloquist, like a man with a little, you can make the puppet voice, but like a wizard version. So Carwin is able to throw his voice in such a way that he can be standing like 50 feet away from someone and they hear it just over their shoulder, like whispering in their ear. And he can perfectly mimic any voice he's ever heard. And this is interesting in its own fashion, but the when it comes to Carwin sort of explaining the rationale for why he has done all these voices that are sort of contradictory and seem to be coming from many different sources and don't seem to have an end goal in mind, and his explanation is essentially, I'm a little imp, and I like tricking people, and as soon as I go into my imp mode, you can't stop me. I just love tricking people, He's also trying to sleep with, or is sleeping with, Clara's maid and doesn't want her to find out. And at the same time, he thinks, well, I should test how brave Clara truly is and do all that, make there seem to be murderers in her closet and all this stuff. It's a very sort of shallow explanation and a bit too perfect and a little bit clumsy as well. Of just, he goes through instance by instance of, oh, here's why I did that voice, and here's why I did this voice, and etc., etc. And it's a little bit like, okay, man, like, you're a weird guy, cool, but that's like, a lot of the mystery is lost. However, there is something very interesting going on with what Carwin does, and this relates to the sort of bigger horror of the novel. Thomas Wieland, who has this personal relation, or is trying to develop this personal relationship to God, hears a voice in his ear, and it tells him to kill his wife and his children, and then eventually try to kill his sister Clara. And he does this. He kills his wife and he kills his children, and fails to kill his sister, but tries anyway. And Clara initially believes that this is more of Carwin's sort of plotting. But when she confronts Carwin about it, he says that he has nothing to do with this one. That he wouldn't go that far as to tell a man to kill his wife or anything like that. Like, that's not impish. That's way beyond impish behavior. And the question becomes, who is this other voice? What is this other voice? What is Thomas Wieland hearing that has turned him into this monster, that has made him do these terrible things? And the sort of answer is twofold. The answer we can glean, because it's left kind of ambiguous in the novel, but the answer is twofold. Now, obviously, we have this origin of Thomas Wieland believing that he can develop a personal relationship with the divine, and that relationship could involve voices. It could involve angels visiting him. I mean, that's a very common thing to happen to people who have that relationship to God, is they have angels approach them. Many, fictionally. I don't mean that happens in real life. I don't know if that happens in real life, but we know the stories of the angels visiting. So it's, he's sort of susceptible to that kind of persuasion. But at the same time, we have this very corporeal or material sense of all of these characters have been hearing these voices. Thomas has heard the voice of Catherine mysteriously calling him. Clara, his sister, has told him of the voices she's heard that have equal times threatened and at other times actually saved her. And so, through Carwin's sort of meddling, Thomas has a sort of rational basis for believing in the existence of non-corporeal voices that tell you things. And if it was just him hearing them, that would be one thing, but he knows his sister hears them too. The ones his sister hears are, of course, Carwin, but because of his sister's experiences, the idea of non-corporeal voices is now real. When you experience something and no one else around you sees it or hears it, that's just you. That's your imagination, that's something going on with you, and you can understand, okay, that's my deal, that's my problem, okay. But when two people, when you and another person both experience the same phenomenon, that's reality. That's our criterion for what is reality. That's what we share. Everything we share that we all see and experience, that's what we call reality. So for Thomas Wieland, through the meddling of Carwin's sort of impish behavior, now believes firmly in the reality of non-corporeal voices appearing and telling you things. Aside from this, and this relates back to the former point, there are biblical there's biblical precedents for what Thomas Wieland experiences in this novel. And that's the really interesting part here. Because, of course, the immediate thing that jumps to mind is the story of Abraham, and Abraham being told by God to sacrifice his son Isaac on the mountain. And Abraham hears this command, and he brings Isaac to the mountain, he takes out the knife, and he's ready to kill him, and at the very last second, an angel comes down and says, "Good job. You followed our orders, but you don't actually have to kill him." The angel switches Isaac out for a lamb, I think, or a goat, I can't remember. But he switches it out for an animal, and Isaac gets to live. But Abraham, through this willingness to sacrifice his own son, has proven his commitment to God, has proven himself as a heroic figure. And you have to remember that this son is not just any son, that Abraham has had to wait over 100 years to have a son, to have Isaac. And this is his only thing in the world. You know, he has this son he's been waiting for that God gave him after all these years. And now God tells him to kill Isaac, and he does it. Or at least he's willing to do it, because he doesn't know that Isaac is going to get switched out at the end. And it's a crazy story. But Abraham is the sort of father of Judeo-Christian faith, of this, impeccable faith in the Word of God, that he's the sort of hero of faith. And it's interesting, it follows, of course, Noah is another man who earlier in the Bible gets the command from God to, build a boat, put all these animals on the boat, and it's like building a boat, nowhere near the sea, putting a bunch of animals on it. It's a weird thing to do. It's not normal, and it's, not easy, and it takes a lot of work, and you kind of feel like a bit of a bozo while you're doing it. But it's not immoral. It doesn't go against your moral code to build a weird boat. We follow that up with Abraham, and he's tested in a much more extreme manner. This is showing that you don't just have to follow God when he tells you to do a weird thing, or even a normal thing, but you have to be willing to follow God to do the most extremely unnatural thing possible. So then it goes against basically every moral code that you can imagine. You have to be willing to do this. And Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, wrote a very interesting book called Fear and Trembling about this moment in the Bible of Abraham sacrificing his son, and what it means as a Christian to have that example touted as a act of heroism. As Abraham is chosen by God, he is a good guy, and he's the father of your Isaac, and then Jacob, and then Joseph, all these people that are looked upon by God as really good guys that he's trying to help out. That's a chosen sort of family. And Kierkegaard just is trying to wrap his head around the absurdity of the true Christian heroism, meaning going against all these Christian precepts, going against the very moral code of Christianity if God tells you to do it. And Wieland, Thomas Wieland in this novel, faces that exact conundrum. Because he believes himself to have been chosen by God. He believes himself to have this personal relationship to God, just like Abraham and Noah do. And God tells him to do this totally messed up thing that goes against everything he believes in, everything everyone believes in. Everyone is going to condemn him for this, obviously, because he kills his wife and children. And he's willing to do it. And more so, he considers this an act of self-sacrifice. That he is willing to face the condemnation of the entire world and to lose those things he loves the most for the sake of his relationship with God. And I think way more than any of this sort of weirdness with Carwin, the ventriloquist, and his, weird nature and his goals that are kind of nonsensical, this sort of horror of Thomas Wieland in this novel is what's really gonna stick with me. And it's almost it's of course a cautionary tale of religious faith. But then, clearly Wieland has gone too far in his individualism of his relationship to God. But at the same time, this individualism, this personal understanding of religion, is a foundational aspect of American culture, of the American spirit, It is so essential to the culture that Charles Brockden Brown is living in. And it has been the cause of much greatness in terms of American art and in terms of American spiritual belief and all this other stuff. And yet there's this really dark possibility that lies within it, that lies within this sort of emulation of Abraham. And this book is an interesting counterpoint to that book by Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling, because Kierkegaard, through it all, still sees Abraham as a hero. He sees him as the sort of quintessential absurdist Christian hero. And of course, Kierkegaard is maybe not speaking his true thoughts. That Kierkegaard wrote under many pseudonyms and espoused many different doctrines that are often contradictory, but it's a very interesting book. So Fear and Trembling and Wieland, Charles Brockden Brown, interesting pairing. And if you are a person who's able to sort of get through a kind of clumsy novel and is able to enjoy books that are written for very different readers, really, readers 300 years ago who had many different expectations, you'll find that there's many interesting things going on in Wieland by Charles Brockden Brown. So this has been another episode of balckwellbooks. I hope you enjoyed this show. If you have any questions or thoughts relating to this book or any of the topics covered in this episode or any other episode of Balkwell's I encourage you to write into the show. balckwellbooks@gmail.com is the email, or you can comment on YouTube or leave a comment on balckwell.online, which is my website where I post primarily nonfiction essays every 2 weeks. If you're interested in my fiction, I have a novel called Only in Dreams that is available right now on Amazon. The music for the show is by Max Miller, aka Fun Bill. Thank you for the music. If you like the show, tell a friend, rate or review it on podcast places or whatever you want to do. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.